High Admiral Vrax of the Zalthar hegemony did not expect to find a middle-aged man in a stained jumpsuit sitting on the command throne of Site Zero. The station was supposed to be the most sensitive tactical listening post in the quadrant. Yet there was no military presence, no automated defense grid, and no sign of the vaunted human apex predators the merchants whispered about. Instead, there was only Arthur. He sat with his boots up on the $50 million credit console, sipping from a ceramic mug that read World's okayest employee. "You are the sovereign representative of the Terran Federation?" Vrax's translator crackled with clinical disbelief. Vrax adjusted his secondary sensory stalks, his scaled armor clinking in the silence of the hollowed-out asteroid. He had 300 warships currently surrounding the station, each bristling with enough firepower to glass a continent. Arthur took a long, slow sip of his coffee and didn't even look up from his data tablet. "Technically, I'm the custodial engineer," Arthur said, his voice carrying the exhausted certainty of someone who had processed too many waste reclamation reports. "But the guys in the suits are at a retreat on Mars, so you're stuck with me. You're about 4 cycles early for the diplomatic summit, Admiral. We haven't even put out the snack trays yet." Vrax's mandibles clicked in a rhythmic display of Zalthar laughter. He had spent 300 cycles expanding his empire, absorbing 17 civilizations that had put up far more of a fight than this. "We are not here for snacks, human. We are here for Site Zero. The Galactic Council has designated this system for strategic repositioning. You have 10 minutes to evacuate your personnel." Arthur finally looked up. His eyes were not filled with the primitive terror Vrax had expected from a species that had only achieved faster-than-light travel 3 centuries ago. Instead, they were calculating, cataloging the Zalthar's posture, their weapon types, and the specific frequency of their shield generators. "See, that's the thing," Arthur said, leaning back. "Site Zero isn't a listening post. It's a door handle. And I'm the guy who keeps it locked so the things inside don't hear you knocking." Vrax felt a prickle of unease, the same instinctual warning a predator feels when the prey stops running. He signaled his security detail to seize the man, but before they could move, the station's lights flickered from a sterile white to a deep, predatory crimson. "What is this?" Vrax demanded, his clawed hand hovering over his sidearm. "That's the alarm for a catastrophic security breach," Arthur explained, checking his watch with a bored sigh. "But it's not for the station. It's for your fleet. You see, Admiral, you've been parked just outside our heliopause for 6 days, thinking you were being subtle. But humans are very good at staying real still until the prey gets comfortable." A holographic display flickered to life in the center of the room. It didn't show Earth's military. It showed the Zalthar home world, 40 light-years away. Vrax watched in frozen horror as his planet's entire global defense grid, the pride of 6 million years of history, simply turned off. "You missed the most important part of the scan," Arthur said, his friendly smile finally reaching his eyes, though it looked more like a threat display. "You thought I was the janitor of the station. I'm actually the janitor of your entire species' digital architecture. And I think I just found a leak." Vrax's communicator screamed with a priority alpha transmission from his flagship. "Admiral, something is emerging from the polar ice on the home world. They aren't ships. They're—" The transmission cut into static as a roar, biological and impossible, echoed through the vacuum of the comms line. Arthur stood up, his casual demeanor vanishing into something cold and surgical. "The grace period just ended, Admiral. Want to see what's behind the door?" High Admiral Vrax forced the human into the high-security interrogation chamber of the hegemony's pride, the Zalthar flagship. Arthur did not struggle. He walked with a casual grace that radiated a controlled, predatory danger. As the heavy blast doors hissed shut, Arthur did not look at the torture implements or the armed guards flanking the room. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and peered critically at the bulkhead seams. "Your armor plating has a micro-fissure in the secondary cooling conduit," Arthur observed, his tone shifting into that of a bored agricultural consultant. "And your guards are standing in a textbook front-on stance. It is a great way to look intimidating, but it creates a massive blind spot on the left flank." Vrax slammed a clawed fist against the obsidian table, his scales flushing a deep, angry purple. "You are a prisoner, human. Your digital tricks on my home world will not save your physical form from the reality of Zalthar justice. Arthur sat down without being asked, making himself comfortable in a chair designed for a creature twice his size. He offered that unsettling human smile, the one that showed too many teeth and served as a primal warning of impending violence. Prisoner is such a narrow term. I prefer to think of myself as an uninvited guest conducting a surprise performance review. Arthur tapped a rhythmic pattern on the table, his eyes tracking every flicker of the Zalthar's 3 sensory stalks. You see, for 73 cycles, humanity played the role of the galactic janitor. We hauled your toxic waste, established your colonies on Deathworlds that would melt your skin, and apologized when you stepped on our feet. We did it with a smile because we understood that cooperation is more profitable than conflict. The interrogation room's primary holographic projector suddenly flared to life, bypassing the Zalthar technician's control entirely. It displayed a live tactical feed of the hegemony's Pride Bridge. A text overlay in Galactic standard appeared over the scrolling data. Tactical assessment, Zalthar Armada. Formation discipline, C-. Sensor discipline, D. Adaptability, fail. What is the meaning of this insolence? Vrax roared, his mandibles clicking with a rhythmic irritation. It is a learning opportunity, Arthur replied calmly. We have been monitoring your invincible armada for 3 standard years. We know your supply lines, your fuel consumption rates, and the exact mathematical moment your crews experience combat fatigue. War is just mathematics, Admiral, and we solved your equation 18 months ago. Arthur leaned forward, his face hardening into a mask of compressed neutronium. Humanity does not send military commanders to peace summits, because when our military shows up, the time for talking has ended. We call it tactical prescience. Every move you are currently making was analyzed and countered before you even left your home system. Vrax's secondary brain struggled to process the humiliation. He reached for his communicator, intent on ordering the total annihilation of the site, 0 asteroid, but the device remained dead in his hand. Sensor operator. Report status. Vrax screamed through the interrogation room's local intercom. The response was filled with the frantic clicking of mandibles and the sound of klaxons. Admiral, the human ships, they are not jumping in from hyperspace. They are uncloaking within our own formation. They are using our dreadnought's engine signatures to mask their own thermal profiles. Arthur checked his watch with a practiced, clinical sigh. That would be the varsity team. They don't like being late for a demonstration. The entire dreadnought suddenly shuddered as a weapon lock of terrifying intensity painted the flagship from dozens of different vectors. Arthur stood up and smoothed his jumpsuit with a pleasant, polite demeanor. Tell me, Vrax, are you familiar with the concept of a zero-sum game? Because I am about to show you how humans turn it into a very quiet debris field. Admiral Vrax's third eye pulsed with a frantic, rhythmic heat as the tactical display of the hegemony's pride turned into a graveyard of red icons. The human vessels, marked with bright orange training stripes, continued to dance through the Zalthar formation with an eerie, coordinated grace that defied every known military doctrine. Vrax felt his secondary stomach churn with a realization that had plagued every species that ever crossed the Terran Federation. Humanity was not fighting a war, they were practicing. You think this is a game? Vrax hissed, his feeding tentacles curling in a display of primal rage. He turned to his gunnery officer, a scaled warrior who had survived 17 planetary sieges. Target the civilian comms relay orbiting the 4th moon. If the humans wish to treat this as a classroom, let us provide a lesson in total casualty management. Arthur, still seated in the interrogation chair, finally stopped the rhythmic tapping of his fingers. The friendly smile, the one Vrax had mistakenly identified as a sign of submission, vanished completely. It was replaced by the unsettling expression of an apex predator that had spent millions of years being hunted by things bigger and meaner until it simply learned to be more dangerous than the nightmare itself. Admiral, I'd strongly advise against that, Arthur said. His voice was no longer conversational. It was flat, carrying the weight of 3 billion graves humanity had dug for itself before reaching the stars. There's a reason the Galactic Council eventually implemented the annoyance protocol for our species. Vrax ignored him, his pride crumbling like a sandcastle in a tsunami. Fire. The hegemony's pride unleashed a concentrated plasma burst. The defenseless civilian relay, a small beacon used for non-military merchant transit, didn't just explode. It was converted into constituent atoms and scattered across the void like cosmic dust. Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He took a long, slow breath through his nose, a specific biological tell that every customs officer and diplomat in the galaxy had learned to fear. He looked at the wreckage on the view screen, then looked Vrax directly in his enormous yellow eyes. "You see, Admiral, humans have stages," Arthur explained quietly, his tone shifting into the Stage 3 final warning where eye contact becomes a predatory lock. Stage 1 is normal, friendly, patient, generally pleasant. We laugh at your jokes and wait in unreasonable lines. Stage 2 is when we tell you there's a problem. Stage 3 is when the smile gets tight and we start counting in our heads. Arthur stood up. The magnetic locks on his restraints didn't just disengage. They were bypassed by a cyber attack so fast the Zalthar security systems didn't even register the breach. He smoothed the front of his jumpsuit and spoke the 4 words that traditionally signaled the end of a civilization's grace period. "Now I'm actually getting annoyed." The temperature in the interrogation room didn't just drop. The moisture in the air began to crystallize on the bulkheads. Across the entire flagship, every alarm began to scream with the particular pitch reserved for catastrophic security breaches and hull fractures. But this wasn't an internal failure. "Admiral," the sensor operator shrieked, his voice climbing several octaves in total shock. "The human ships, they aren't using training munitions anymore. Their energy signatures just went off the scale. Oh no, they're targeting our life support systems with surgical precision." Arthur walked toward the blast doors, which slid open before him as if he owned the ship. He paused and looked back at Vrax, whose scales had turned a pale white, the Zalthar equivalent of existential dread. "We're predators who chose to become diplomats because we understood that the alternative was our own extinction," Arthur said, his voice echoing in the chaos of the bridge. "You just made us choose the alternative. And we've been practicing violence far longer than we've been practicing diplomacy." As Arthur stepped out into the corridor, the holographic display in the center of the bridge flickered one last time. The tactical assessment grade for the Zalthar hegemony was deleted. In its place, a single, blood-red word appeared in every Zalthar's neural interface: terminated. The ship's gravity suddenly reversed, throwing the crew into the ceiling as the varsity team began a demonstration of what happens when humans stop playing nice. The hegemony's pride did not explode. Instead, it became a classroom. As the gravity stabilized into a disorienting, low-power hum, every view screen on the bridge flickered from red alerts to a clean, blue and white interface. High Admiral Vrax watched in a state of catatonic shock as the tactical grid transformed into a performance-tracking dashboard. His fleet, the pride of 17 systems, was now being displayed as a series of instructional targets. Across the open, unhackable human frequencies, a new voice crackled. It was not the voice of a soldier, but the weary, encouraging tone of a human educator. "All right, class, eyes on the primary dreadnought. This is a textbook example of a rigid, centralized command structure. Notice how the escorts maintain a fixed formation? That is what we call the hunter's fallacy. They are so focused on looking like a wall that they have forgotten how to be a net." Arthur stood in the center of the bridge, his ceramic mug empty, but his presence filling the room with the casual authority of a visiting professor. He gestured toward the main screen where a Zalthar cruiser was being systematically dismantled, not by heavy ordnance, but by precision energy bursts that targeted the exact microseconds of its shield refresh cycle. "That is Bravo Squadron, Year 2, Arthur explained, nodding toward the screen with a hint of pride. "They are focusing on deflection shooting and energy management today. Usually, we just use drones for these drills, but having a live, aggressive opposition force really adds to the realism." Points for the dramatic entrance, Admiral. It really helped the students engage with the scenario. Vrax's secondary brain screamed in humiliation as he realized the human ships were broadcasting performance reviews to his entire fleet. His communications officer, shaking so violently his scales were clicking, brought up the data. The Zalthar hegemony was currently ranked 14th on a live leaderboard. They were trailing behind 9 other human trainee squadrons and a group labeled Junior ROTC Space Camp. We are not a teaching aid. Vrax managed to choke out, his pride crumbling into a bitter, black void. We are the hegemony. We have reduced planets to rubble. And that is exactly why you are so valuable as a lesson, Arthur replied, his voice hardening. You represent the old way of warfare, might through mass, peace through fear. Humanity spent thousands of years perfecting that art against itself before we decided to be better. Now, we use your outdated tactics to teach our children how to protect the galaxy without becoming the monsters they are fighting. A sudden alarm, different from the others, pulsed through Arthur's handheld tablet. He frowned, the casual instructor persona flickering for a moment to reveal the janitor beneath. Instructor Chun, this is Site 0. We have an unauthorized energy spike in the lower containment levels. The exercise might have to go into a hardlock scenario. Vrax lunged for Arthur, desperation finally overriding his fear, but he hit an invisible barrier, a localized kinetic field that froze him in place. I told you, Admiral, Arthur said, his eyes turning back to the predatory crimson of the station's earlier alarm. Site 0 isn't a listening post. It's a door handle. Your ships were vibrating the hull at the exact frequency needed to wake up the things we keep in the basement. As Arthur turned to leave the bridge, the human fleet outside suddenly stopped its dancing maneuvers. They formed a tight, protective shell around Site 0, their weapons rotating inward, pointing not at the Zalthar, but at the asteroid they had just invaded. The class is over, Arthur said quietly. The janitor has to go back to work. Because if the Zalthar found a way in, the things inside might have found a way out. The hegemony's pride groaned as something from deep within the Site 0 asteroid let out a sound that didn't just transmit through the hull. It transmitted through the very souls of everyone on the bridge. Arthur left Admiral Vrax paralyzed on the bridge of his own flagship, a man whose 6 million years of imperial history was currently being critiqued by human teenagers. The emergency alarm at Site 0 shifted its pitch again, moving from a standard security alert to a low-frequency thrum that vibrated the very atoms of the Zalthar fleet. Arthur descended into the Pale Legacy containment zone, passing through 17 layers of hyper-compressed neutronium shielding. Each door he passed required a biometric key that only the janitor possessed, not because he was the lowest-ranking employee, but because he was the only one the occupants of the basement recognized. You think we built these stations to listen for you? Arthur's voice echoed through the flagship's hijacked intercom as he reached the final bioseal. We built them to keep the noise of the galaxy out. These entities don't like being woken up by amateur conquests, and you've been banging on the front door for 6 standard days. On the bridge view screen, the Zalthar crew watched in frozen horror as the northern pole of the Site 0 asteroid didn't just crack, it unmade itself. From the wound, something emerged that defied every comfortable assumption the Galactic Council had made about biological limits. It was a dragon, nearly 2 kilometers in length, its iridescent scales absorbing the light of the nearest star in ways that made it look like a hole in reality. Biological entities cannot survive in a vacuum. The Zalthar sensor operator stammered, his compound eyes reflecting the impossible data as the creature unfurled wings the size of a battlecruiser. It is generating energy signatures that it shouldn't exist. Our physics says it cannot exist. Tell that to the sensor grid. Arthur's voice crackled, devoid of his earlier humor. We call these the dragons of the Pale. They've been asleep since before your people discovered fire. We made bargains with them in the deep places of Earth, promising them a quiet place to sleep in exchange for the legacy of our world. The dragon opened its mouth, and what emerged was not fire, but plasma contained within a biological magnetic field, superheated to temperatures that made stellar cores seem cool by comparison. The beam struck the Zalthar cruiser Star Eater, and for exactly half a second, the most advanced shield technology in the quadrant held. Then, the shields collapsed, the armor vaporized, and the ship simply ceased to exist, converted into constituent atoms that drifted like cosmic dust. That's just the opening act, Arthur said as he stepped into the final vault, his small form dwarfed by the shadows within. You taught us that the real monsters wear masks of civilization and speak of acceptable casualties. You taught us that our compassion was a weakness to be exploited. So, we decided to become the monsters that other monsters make deals with. The floor of the vault groaned as a second entity began to rise. It was vaguely humanoid, 300 meters tall, built from living metal that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that hurt the Zalthar eyes to perceive. Its eyes burned with fusion reactions, and as it stood, it reached out with a massive hand and simply closed its fist around a Zalthar destroyer as if it were tissue paper. Arthur stood before the Titan, a man in a gray jumpsuit looking up at a living god. "They're early," Arthur said to the entity, his voice echoing in the chamber. And they were very, very loud. Suddenly, every sensor on the hegemony's pride didn't just fail, they screamed. A third energy signature, infinitely larger and more wrong than the dragons or the titans, began to emerge from the station's core. This one existed in layers of quantum probability, and as it looked at the fleet, the Zalthar ships didn't just explode. They began to unmake themselves from the inside out, atoms forgetting how to bond. The Zalthar flagship, Hegemony's Pride, groaned as if the vacuum of space itself were pressing in on its hull. High Admiral Vrax stared at the tactical sensors, watching the impossible unfold. The human fleet hadn't arrived through the thunderous tear of a jump gate. They had simply appeared, as if the darkness between the stars had decided to grow teeth. Thousands of combat vessels, previously masquerading as space debris or simply running cold to avoid detection, blazed to life in a perfect, suffocating sphere around the Zalthar armada. They were already there, the sensor officer whispered, his voice cracking with the realization that the Zalthar had been surrounded for 6 days without knowing it. They were just waiting. Arthur, still standing within the hyper-shielded vault of sight, Zero, looked into the camera of the Zalthar's hijacked feed. His slouch was gone. The weary janitor had vanished, replaced by a man who radiated the kind of controlled danger that comes from decades of military service. He wasn't Arthur the Custodian. He was Admiral Marcus Webb of the Terran Defense Force. "There's a hunting technique many of Earth's apex predators use," Webb said, his voice calm and conversational despite the chaos. "They stay very, very still. They don't charge at the prey making noise. They wait, let the prey come to them, and let it get comfortable until it thinks there is no danger. And then they strike." Vrax lunged for the manual override on his command throne, but the ship's systems responded with a polite, human-sounding chime. "Access denied, Admiral." The ship's AI spoke in a voice that sounded suspiciously like Webb's attaché. "Your tactical permissions have been revoked by the Terran Administrative Oversight." Webb stepped out from the shadows of the vault, his simple gray jumpsuit now looking less like a uniform and more like a shroud. "You asked why humanity doesn't send military commanders to peace summits, Vrax. It's because our military is too efficient. It doesn't leave room for future diplomatic relations. We once ended a war involving 40,000 warships in less than 11 hours. After that, we decided to keep the generals separate from the talking, because when the generals arrive, the talking is already over." On the bridge, Vrax watched as the human fleet, the real fleet, not the trainees, began a surgical demonstration of dominance. They didn't fire a single planet-cracking round. Instead, they utilized tactical prescience, countering every fallback position the Zalthar attempted to reach before the Zalthar even decided to move there. Communications relays were disabled, engine signatures were suppressed, and weapons were neutralized by gaps in shields that existed for only microseconds. "You aren't fighting us," Webb said, his image flickering as he moved toward the station's primary hangar. "You're fighting mathematics. We've already calculated every option you have and removed each one systematically." The Hegemony's Pride shuddered as the massive humanoid titan outside reached down, not to crush the ship, but to gently guide it toward the human carrier Resolve. The message was clear. Resistance was no longer just futile. It was mathematically impossible. "Admiral Vrax," Webb's voice echoed one last time through the flagship. "The 11-hour clock has started. I'd suggest you spend the next few minutes deciding how you'd like to explain to your people that the janitor is actually the man who holds the keys to your entire empire's survival." As Webb boarded his personal transport, a new holographic data stream began uploading to every ship in the Zalthar fleet. It wasn't a demand for surrender. It was a spreadsheet. The bridge of the hegemony's pride was silent, save for the rhythmic, desperate chirping of the Zalthar data processing hubs. High Admiral Vrax stared at the holographic display, which was no longer flickering with tactical debris or sensor ghosts. Instead, it was filled with thousands of rows of pristine, terrifyingly organized Terran data. It was not a demand for total surrender, nor was it a gallery of human military medals. It was a logistics and infrastructure model. It's a spreadsheet, the Zalthar logistics officer whispered, his primary feeding tentacles trembling as he scrolled through the variables. They haven't sent a virus. They've sent a predictive accounting of our entire civilization. From the viewing gallery of the human carrier Resolve, Admiral Marcus Webb watched the Zalthar flagship drift helplessly within the Titan's grip. He was no longer wearing the stained jumpsuit of a janitor. He stood in the crisp, dark uniform of the Terran Defense Force, though he still held that same ceramic coffee mug. Beside him, Dr. Patricia Wong, a specialist in human strategic resource management, adjusted the display. The Zalthar represent a zero-sum conflict, Dr. Wong observed, her voice clinical and detached. They believe war is about honor, bravery, and superior firepower. We are showing them that war is actually about accounting. On the Zalthar bridge, Vrax watched as the human model began to run its simulations. The Terrans had not just calculated the hegemony's current ammunition counts. They had mapped the Zalthar supply lines, their fuel consumption rates, and the exact caloric requirements of their 17-system military force. The human algorithms were systematic, removing every single fallback option the Zalthar possessed. "Look at the 11-hour mark," Vrax commanded, his voice barely a croak. The display zoomed in on a specific cell in the spreadsheet, highlighted in a cold, human blue. At exactly 10 hours and 47 minutes from the current time, the Zalthar fleet would reach a critical resource exhaustion event. Because the humans had disabled the specific jump gate relays and mining outposts 18 months ago through minor trade disputes, the Zalthar now had no way to refuel or rearm. They wouldn't lose a battle. They would simply run out of everything critical needed to exist as a military force. They didn't defeat us through courage, the Zalthar logistics officer realized, his scales turning a flat, defeated gray. They defeated us through logistics. They knew we would run out of resources exactly 17 hours after engagement began. They just waited for us to do the math ourselves. Webb's voice crackled over the Zalthar bridge speakers, calm and professional. "This is not a threat, Admiral Vrax. It is context. We have identified 47 uninhabited colony worlds that could support your population growth without conflict. We have drafted infrastructure plans that create economic interdependence rather than war. We have designed a scenario where breaking this agreement is mathematically irrational." Vrax looked at the human fleet, the silent, patient predators that had surrounded him before he even knew they existed. He looked at the Titan that could crush his flagship, but chose to hold it steady instead. The human janitor hadn't been mocking them. He had been providing a lecture to a species that was too arrogant to realize they were already extinct. "We are accountants with warships, Admiral," Webb said, his smile returning, sharp and unavoidable. "And we just found a massive error in your books." The Zalthar flagship's power suddenly surged back to life, but it was no longer under Vrax's control. The humans had begun a remote-guided jump sequence. The Zalthar hegemony was not being sent home. They were being moved to a location where their surrender would be made permanent. As the hegemony's pride prepared to enter the slipstream, Vrax saw a final notification on his console. It was an invitation to a formal trade summit on Earth, but there was one specific condition for the Zalthar delegation. The high-tension hum of the jump drive filled the bridge, but Vrax was looking at the sensor reading from the deep core of Site 0. The monsters Arthur had woken up were not retreating. They were following. The conference hall of eternal accord, which had witnessed 12 millennia of diplomatic history, was now host to a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. High Admiral Vrax and the remaining Zalthar delegation sat across from Admiral Marcus Webb, who had traded his stained janitor's jumpsuit for a perfectly tailored suit. There were no weapons in the room, no armored guards, and no fusion warheads. Instead, there was a tray of delicate pastries and a pot of steaming tea. Vrax stared at the human, his three eyes tracking every movement with a primal wariness. Webb was smiling, Not the predatory mask he had worn on the bridge, but a pleasant, professional expression. To Vrax, it was deeply unsettling to see a creature that had just mathematically dismantled his empire now baring its teeth in a display humans called a greeting. "Please, help yourselves," Webb said, gesturing to the refreshments with the same hand that had authorized the annoyance protocol. "I find that trade negotiations are far more productive when everyone is comfortable." The Zalthar representatives did not reach for the food. They had learned the hard way that humans were most dangerous when they were being polite. "We have reviewed the terms of the Terran-Zalthar Integration Accord," Vrax began, his voice lacking its former imperial boom. "You require us to return the New Perth colony, open our secret archives, and," he paused, his mandibles twitching in disbelief, "mandate species identification training for our entire officer corps?" "Correct," Webb replied, pouring himself a cup of tea with practiced, surgical precision. "We want to ensure that no future Zalthar commander ever mistakes a human custodial engineer for a primitive native again. It's about context, Admiral." Dr. Patricia Wong slid a data tablet across the table. It didn't contain ship counts. It was a roadmap for shared resource management and agricultural development. "We are not here to occupy your worlds," she explained softly. "Humanity prefers to turn enemies into allies through economic interdependence. It is much more efficient than annihilation." Vrax looked out the massive observation window behind Webb. In the distance, the Arctic dragon and the living metal titan remained visible, now drifting as a ceremonial escort for the human fleet. They were a silent, terrifying reminder of what sat behind the door at Site 0. "You are apex predators," Vrax whispered, a realization crystallizing in his primary brain. "The smile, the tea, the spreadsheets, it is all a costume. We're apex predators who chose to have table manners," Webb corrected, his eyes flashing with that ancient, cold certainty. "We evolved on a death world that tried to kill us every single day for 4 billion years. We learned that cooperation was the only way to survive our own nature. We genuinely prefer peace, Admiral, because we know exactly how good we are at the alternative." The Zalthar High Admiral picked up the stylus and signed the accord. The 11-hour clock stopped with exactly 3 seconds to spare. The hegemony had been dismantled not by plasma fire, but by a species that treated warfare as a solved mathematical problem and diplomacy as a choice for the merciful. 1 week, Elor Arthur sat on the observation deck of Site 0, his boots back up on the $50 million credit console. He was back in his stained jumpsuit, nursing a fresh mug of coffee as he watched the waste reclamation report scroll by. Through the viewport, he watched a Zalthar merchant ship approach the station. This time, it didn't park outside the heliopause for 6 days. It stopped at a respectful distance, transmitted its scanning data immediately, and sent a polite, high-priority request for docking permissions. Arthur tapped a command on his tablet, opening the bay doors. "Welcome to Site 0, he murmured into the comms. "Watch your step on the docking ramp. The floor was just waxed." He leaned back, looking at the silent, dark asteroid around him. The monsters in the basement were asleep once more, the cages were secure, and the janitor was back on his shift. The galaxy had learned its lesson. Never mistake kindness for weakness, and never, under any circumstances, knock on a door that humanity has spent 10,000 years trying to keep closed. Arthur took a sip of his coffee and smiled. It was a nice, polite, human smile.